Hello and welcome to Study Sessions, the English Literature Revision podcast from St. George's. My name, of course, is Mr. Boff. After the Mrs. Colson interregnum, just like at the end of Macbeth, order is now restored. The rightful king is back on the throne. Now, today we're going to be journeying through Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. Remarkably, after 25 episodes, we still haven't had a Christmas Carol one. So this is the first, hopefully in a long line of Christmas Carol episodes to come. And today we're going to be tracing the remarkable moral transformation of the novella's protagonist, a certain Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, this is a transformation that's not just a change in Scrooge's outward behavior, but actually marks a profound shift in Scrooge's understanding of himself and his place in the world. So let's dive into his journey from miserly parsimony to altruistic generosity and think really carefully about what it reveals regarding human nature, capitalism, and Victorian society. In Stave 1, Dickens introduces Scrooge famously as a, quote, tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, a squeezing, a wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. He is literature's quintessential miser, and his cold-hearted nature extends well beyond just his business practices. More on that later. His very presence repels warmth and humanity. He is, quote, solitary as an oyster, that hard outer shell, pushing away all human sympathy as he edges his way along the crowded paths of life. And Scrooge physically embodies the frostiness of his demeanour and his personality. Now, here Dickens employs a very important conceptual metaphor, and it's linked to temperature. And this serves to emphasize Scrooge's moral frigidity. He is described as hard and sharp as flint, and his very essence seems to radiate an emotional iciness that freezes and reduces the temperature of those around him. Now, this contrasts sharply and importantly with his nephew Fred, who, in rather sharp contrast, exudes warmth both physically and emotionally, bursting into Scrooge's counting house in a glow and with a voice and a demeanour ruddy and handsome. Now, this interplay of coldness and warmth serves as an extended metaphor for Scrooge's isolation and the potential for human connection that he has long rejected. Scrooge's disdain and dismissive attitude for and towards Christmas is absolutely legendary. He sneers at Fred's Christmas cheer with the infamous "bah, humbug," and coldly dismisses charity, insisting the poor should seek workhouses or simply, rather cruelly and callously, decrease the surplus population. Now, before we come to some of the philosophical and economic allusions of that line, it is worth just pointing out how transactional Scrooge's language is here. He says very little. What he does say is essentially transactional in nature. And this is going to be a stark contrast with the way he uses language right at the end of Stave 5 when he's undergone his transformation. Now, let's come back to decrease the surplus population. This phrase, notorious phrase, which Scrooge utters in Stave 1, exemplifies his cold, unfeeling, utilitarian mindset and, as you may well know, alludes to the Malthusian, named after Thomas Malthus, the Malthusian economic theory of population control. Now, this Thomas Malthus argued that poverty and famine were necessary and natural checks or limits on overpopulation, and this was a philosophical and economic perspective that Dickens himself vehemently opposed. Don't forget that later, the Ghost of Christmas Present is going to repeat these words back to Scrooge. And this is Dickens forcing his protagonist and us as readers to confront the brutal inhumanity of such a stance, highlighting instead the need for empathy and this is crucial, social responsibility. But here, early on in stave one, Scrooge's philosophy is one of extreme self-interest, reflecting the very worst aspects of Victorian capitalism. But wait, Dickens hints that this cold exterior, this hard exterior, this oyster-like exterior conceals a softness, a long-buried vulnerability, and maybe, just maybe, there's a little pearl in there to be found too. Scrooge is not irredeemable. He's not beyond redemption, and his transformation is about to begin. Now, we've got the catalyst for Scrooge's change, and I think the catalyst for Scrooge's change is the arrival of a ghost that's often ignored. We all know Ghost of Christmas, past, present, and yet to come, but a lot of students overlook Marley. And so we get that first glimmer of change in Scrooge with the ghost of his old and now deceased business partner, Jacob Marley. Now, this Jacob Marley is weighed down. What's he weighed down by? He's weighed down by chains which contain or have attached to them, quote, cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. These are the tools of usury, symbolic of the exploitative nature of Scrooge and Marley's wealth. Their business was not one of a, let's say, productive form of capitalism, in which wealth is generated through trade or industry and manufacturing, but rather they've made their money through financial extraction, money lending that preyed upon the vulnerable. By profiting from debt, Scrooge and Marley have accumulated riches through the suffering of others. And I think here Dickens is offering a stark critique of Victorian economic systems that allow the rich to grow richer while the poor become increasingly indebted. Dickens's choice to shackle Marley in the very symbols of his profession underscores the moral and the spiritual toll of such ruthless profiteering. This haunting imagery here symbolizes the burden of greed, and Marley is really paying for it now. Marley warns Scrooge of the fate that awaits him if he himself does not change. So Marley's ghost is a moment of confrontation with consequences. His suffering, Marley's suffering, is a direct result of a life lived entirely devoid of compassion. He explicitly states, Marley, quote, mankind was my business. And this is a phrase that I think plays on the polysemous nature of that word business. Marley, in life, had treated business solely as financial gain, neglecting the true business of human connection, charity, and social responsibility. This semantic tussle over the meaning of the word business highlights the central moral failing of Marley and Scrooge, their prioritization of wealth over and above humanity. Now, for Scrooge, this visit, which at first he sort of dismisses as almost a hallucination, and then comes to realize it's absolutely not that, and is very, very important and indeed unavoidable. But for Scrooge, this visit is both terrifying and revelatory, forcing him to reconsider his worldview and setting the stage for the transformative visits of the three spirits. So let's turn now to Scrooge going back in time and that ghost of Christmas past. The first spirit transports Scrooge back in time and forces him to confront memories he has long buried. Poor boy, Scrooge whispers upon seeing his younger self alone in a schoolroom. For the first time, at least thus far in the novella, he experiences true pity. Here, though, not for others, but for himself. This moment is really significant. Why? Because it marks the first stirrings of empathy, a crucial step in his transformation. it also allows readers to understand the formative experiences, those early life experiences that have shaped Scrooge into the man he has now become. On the one hand, I think that builds empathy in readers for Scrooge. We see, in some ways, why he is now the way that he is. But it also shows us that our early childhood experiences, however traumatic, however painful, need not entirely shape us. That we can make other choices. We can make moral choices that move us beyond and away from those early traumatic, and in Scrooge's case, isolated experiences. So it shows us the possibility of moral transformation if we choose it. Now, next, Scrooge relives his apprenticeship under Fezziwig. And Fezziwig is a jovial, fun, light-hearted, generous businessman who hosts, we see, a lavish Christmas party for his employees, one of whom is Scrooge himself as a young man, as an apprentice. Now, Scrooge here is moved by this scene, and it is a scene of joy and of fun and of laughter and of generosity. And Scrooge actually defends Fezziwig's generosity. It's interesting that the Ghost of Christmas Past gives Scrooge the opportunity to defend Fezziwig. And Scrooge says, quote, "The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." Now, this statement here is itself a revelation. So early on, in fact, in the novella, this is Scrooge acknowledging that wealth is not the only measure of value, an idea that starkly contrasts his miserly outlook at the beginning of the book. Fezziwig here, I think, represents a benevolent form of capitalism, a capitalism with a human face, demonstrating clearly that one can run a successful business while still treating employees with kindness and respect. However, the most painful moment with the Ghost of Christmas Past for Scrooge comes when he sees Belle, his former fiancée, and she ends their engagement. She tells him, "Another idol has displaced me, a golden one." Now, this is a line writ in biblical allusion, evoking both the worship of Mammon, the god of wealth and money, and the golden calf, that false idol from Exodus, which symbolizes misplaced devotion. Scrooge's relentless pursuit of money has supplanted his human relationships, leading, ironically in some ways, to his spiritual and emotional impoverishment. In painfully witnessing Belle's future happiness, he can barely deal with seeing it. It's so painful. He wants to be removed from this moment. But in being forced, don't forget that the Ghost of Christmas Past pinions Scrooge's arms. You will see this. You will watch this. In witnessing Belle's future happiness with her new family, he feels now deep remorse. He realizes that he has been the architect. He has constructed his own loneliness. Now, the second spirit, the Ghost of Christmas Present, exposes Scrooge to the joys, yes, but also the struggles of the present, forcing him, in many ways, to witness the lives of those he has overlooked. Overlooked because of his spiritual and emotional myopia and coldness. The Cratchit family, despite their poverty, unlike Scrooge, radiate warmth and love. Tiny Tim, the ailing child, is full of gratitude, and Bob Cratchit even toasts Scrooge as the founder of the feast, despite how parsimonious and cruel Scrooge is towards Bob Cratchit. However, Mrs. Cratchit, and I have a lot of time for Mrs. Cratchit, in stark contrast to her husband, I would say is a little bit weak there. He should be, I think, joining in the criticism of Scrooge, refuses to offer Scrooge any goodwill, exclaiming, "I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." A lot more sympathy, I think, here for Mrs. Scratchit for me. Her anger reflects the real suffering that Scrooge's miserly attitude and approach has inflicted upon the working poor. Don't forget, Bob Cratchit is a hard worker, and yet he's still in poverty. So he can't say, you're in poverty because you're not working hard enough. Bob Cratchit is working incredibly poor. He's poor because of Scrooge's poverty pay. Yet, even in their modest Christmas dinner, and there's something very poignant, very touching about this, their simple goose, small amount of potatoes, a tiny pudding, even how modest their Christmas dinner is, they find in it immense joy and gratitude. The Cratchits take pride in making the most of their limited means, with Mrs. Cratchit and her daughters braving ribbons. So this is a quote, braving ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence. And, of course, the fact that Mrs. Cratchit is wearing, again, poignant observation from Dickens, a twice-turned gown. A testament to their ability to maintain dignity despite their financial hardship that they experience because of Scrooge himself. Dickens emphasizes in this vignette of the Cratchits at Christmas that true wealth is found in familial love and shared experiences rather than material abundance. Their enjoyment of such humble fare around that symbol of warmth and family, the hearth, underscores the idea that happiness stems from not from excess, not from material abundance and material accumulation, but from appreciation and love and togetherness. And this is a lesson that Scrooge is learning, however painful that might be. I'm briefly interrupting this episode for the Easter egg. Listen carefully and make sure once you've got it, email me or your normal English teacher and you'll have the opportunity to win a prize. Here comes the Easter egg. The happiness Mr. Boff gives is quite as great as if it costs a fortune. One more time. The happiness Mr. Boff gives is quite as great as if it costs a fortune. Good luck. The spirit of Christmas present doesn't simply show Scrooge the warmth of those celebrating in London, but also takes Scrooge to a series of remote places. I want to talk about one of these moments now. And this reinforces the idea of Christmas joy as a universal experience, even taking place even among those in the very harshest of conditions. Quote, "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit, "but they know me. See." Now, as Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present move through the wall of what seems to be a very modest and very simple hut, they witness a multi-generational family gathered around a glowing fire. Those fireplaces, again, very important in this book. Dickens carefully crafts this image to emphasize the endurance, the persistence of festive spirit, despite their material deprivation. The old man leads the singing of a Christmas song, illustrating here that tradition and human connection can provide comfort, even in the bleakest settings. The contrast between the physical harshness of the miners' world and their emotional warmth serves as a rather critical counterpoint to Scrooge's earlier rejection of Christmas. Here, Dickens is suggesting that joy is not derived from wealth, but from these shared human experiences. And again, that reinforces the novella's moral imperative that generosity and kindness, not financial gain, define true richness. So Scrooge is being presented with these experiences, and it is causing serious introspection and reflection over how he has been living his life. Now, I want to turn to the introduction of two savage, spectral children, Ignorance and Want, who cling to the robe of the Ghost of Christmas Present. Now, their emaciated forms symbolize, represent, stand in for societal neglect, these social ills, and their presence serves as, I think, Dickens's sharpest and most acute social critique. Ignorance, described as, quote, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, embodies the dangers of a population kept in deprivation and uneducated, while want represents extreme poverty and suffering. And remember, these are man's, these are our creation. The reason why they exist is because of the behavior of man, and particularly people like Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, sometimes what's overlooked is the way the spirit delivers a really chilling warning, okay, that doom is written upon the brow of ignorance, that unless action is taken, okay, that it spells doom. Something terrible is going to happen. We'll think in a moment about what that is. But this is reinforcing, I think, Dickens's deep fears that were around at the time in the 1840s about social unrest, really serious social unrest. Remember, the 1840s were known as the Hungry 40s, and even the potential for violent revolution. The ghost, the spectre of the French Revolution in 1789 is still haunting England in the 1840s. And of course, in the context of early Victorian Britain, where poverty and child labour were rife, this moment, this interaction with these creatures, with these monstrous children, highlights the consequences of neglect on a systemic level. So when Scrooge asks if there's no refuge for them, the spirit again fires his own words back at him. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And when it's revealed that if Scrooge doesn't change his ways, then Tiny Tim will die, famous "I see a vacant seat," okay, that is reminding us that there are serious kind of personal consequences for Scrooge's misanthropy. Again, when Scrooge expresses concern about the fate of Tiny Tim, the Ghost of Christmas Present fires those words back. It'd be better if he died and decrease the surplus population, bringing home, I think, for Scrooge, the real human consequences of his actions, of his selfish individualism, and his obsessive, avaricious focus on ever yet more material accumulation and wealth. So this is a very powerful moment that underscores, I think, in this interaction with the Ghost of Christmas Present, Scrooge's growing awareness of the consequences of his indifference. And I think it's reflecting a broader social anxiety, which is if the privileged continue to ignore the suffering of the poor, the result may be, and I think this is something that Dickens fears, don't forget he uses the word doom, the result may be violent upheaval. Okay, a theme, as I've said, that loomed extremely large in Dickens's time. Now we turn to the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, and it's important to remember that the final spirit offers no words, only deeply ominous visions of the future. Now, in these interactions, Scrooge is confronted with his own mortality. It's worth remembering that we are all, according to Fred, he's quite right in this, in pointing out the vulnerability and fragility of all humans, irrespective of their level of financial wealth, that all of us are fellow passengers to the grave. And I think it is this confrontation with mortality and the way his death is met with such apathy, or even at times jubilation, his possessions stolen, his name forgotten, that really is this horrible wake-up call for Scrooge. He's got to change his ways. The callous indifference of the business community to his death is very stark, but I think it's that thieves' den where Mrs. Dilber and others are gleefully stripping his corpse of belongings, that the full horror, kind of gothic horror, of his lonely demise is realised. Their lack of respect, their amusement at his death, emphasise how utterly disconnected Scrooge was from broader humanity. And I think this is again further reinforced and underscored in the actual exchange between them, as one woman scoffs, "What odds then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." Now, here in that interaction, Dickens is demonstrating how Scrooge's selfish individualism has encouraged the same antisocial mentality in others. His entire life, Scrooge's entire life, was built upon the principle of ruthless self-interest, and in death, you know what? He is repaid in kind. They feel no moral hesitation in stripping his body of possessions because Scrooge himself embodies an ethos, or embodied an ethos, that valued self-preservation above compassion. And so in this way, Dickens is illustrating the corrosive effect of unchecked greed. Not only does it socially isolate the miser, but it also fosters a society more broadly where self-interest triumphs over communal responsibility. Now, desperate to alter his fate, Scrooge surrenders to the spirit's guidance. He exclaims, quote, "Lead on," said Scrooge, "lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." So look at that repetition. Lead on, more, carry on. He's now completely accepting his need for change. And this is a moment that really signifies that full acceptance of his need for change. That phrase, precious time, underscores a newfound urgency. And he's recognizing his fate is not yet sealed. He still has the power, by changing his actions, making different choices, he has the power to alter his legacy and also save Tiny Tim. Where before he hoarded wealth, he now seems to be valuing time itself, precious time, not precious money, not those precious ledgers and lockboxes, but time itself. And that's suggesting, I think, a shift away from an obsessive focus on materialism and material possessions and wealth to a much deeper and richer understanding of what truly matters in life. However, the most, for me, and I think for Scrooge too, devastating revelation is the sight of the Cratchits mourning Tiny Tim. It's very difficult not to be moved by these moments. Scrooge himself, seeing their grief, is personally moved to tears. And this is a moment, I think, that really contrasts sharply with that vision of his own neglected grave. It's a dark and forgotten place, and that's obviously emblematic of the life that he's led. Don't forget, in contrast, Tiny Tim's resting place is described as green. Okay, that's a direct quotation. It's well tended, and that is symbolic. It's a representation of the love and the warmth that he brought in life to others. So this juxtaposition highlights the really stark difference between a life filled with compassion, on the one hand, Tiny Tim, and one driven by selfishness, Scrooge's life. It's this realization and the whole weight of all of the other spectral experiences that he's had that pushes Scrooge towards that final plea for redemption. And I think there is a huge vulnerability there. Okay, there's a sense in which one's obsessive focus on wealth is a denial of human vulnerability. But here he seems utterly authentic and emotionally open and vulnerable. He pleads, quote, "Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was." This is a moment of, in some ways, emotional and moral collapse. He is desperate for redemption. I mean, moral collapse as in his old sense of morality, if we want to term it like that, it has now completely fallen away. And he's got this new morality really powerfully conveyed in that very heartfelt pledge, quote, "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach." So here, Scrooge articulates the full extent of this transformation, promising to internalize the moral lessons that he's learned over the course of these, 4 visitations. That emphasis there, think about zooming in, honoring Christmas all year, signifies a shift from mere seasonal goodwill to a much more enduring commitment to generosity, to kindness, and human connection. That vow to not shut out these lessons reinforces the recognition that change has to be ongoing rather than temporary. And then finally, that imagery, that powerful image of the spirits striving within him, emphasizes that Scrooge is now an active participant in his own redemption. He's not just some passive recipient, which we might see him as earlier on, of their guidance, but someone willing to carry their teachings forward into their day-to-day life. So we turn now to stave 5, and this final stave presents the culmination of Scrooge's metamorphosis, his transformation, and of course, Scrooge's redemption. Waking on Christmas morning, Scrooge is filled with an almost childlike joy. His former miserly attitude, his cynicism, his skepticism, entirely replaced by gratitude and generosity. And there is a sense of abundance in his language itself, that minimal transactional sort of language that Scrooge is using at the start of the book is replaced with quotations like this: I don't know what to do. I am as light as a feather. I am as happy as an angel. I am as merry as a schoolboy. There is a sense of joy, of possibility, and also of relish, enjoyment almost in abundance of language itself, the abundance of language itself. And I think what all of this does is it serves to illustrate his newfound emotional freedom. Those repeated similes reinforce just the extent of his spiritual and emotional and moral rebirth. He's no longer weighed down by the chains of greed. He's no longer lugging around those chains that Marley is dragging around in the afterlife. He is embracing the world with exuberance and an innocent childlike wonder. So we've got the language in the final stave, very, very different, both in terms of what Scrooge says, but also the description changes. What's going on in terms of the weather and the location. The oppressive fog, for example, and darkness that characterize the setting of stave 1 have lifted. They symbolize, or that lifting symbolizes Scrooge's spiritual awakening. Scrooge actually laughs, and that's a sound essentially absent from the rest of his life earlier on, and experiences a most illustrious laugh, as though even his laughter has been renewed. So Dickens is presenting this moment as one of total and complete redemption, with Scrooge committing himself to change, not just for a single day, of course, but for the rest of his life. Now, Scrooge's transformation perhaps is most evident in his actions. He anonymously sends the Cratchits their turkey, significantly altering their Christmas experience. When he encounters the charitable gentleman that he previously rebuffed, he eagerly donates a large sum, whispering, quote, a great many back payments are included in it. This admission acknowledges his past failures, demonstrating that his change is not just performative, but rooted in deep self-awareness. I also like the fact, I think it's very, very important, the anonymity, the fact that he whispers the donation to the charitable gentleman. There is a sense in which he isn't seeking to make these huge acts of philanthropy and generosity public. He wants to do it quietly, and therefore it feels far more altruistic and generously sort of authentic, rather than doing it for broader public consumption where people will then praise you for it. And he does it quietly, and I think that makes it all the more moving and touching. But perhaps the most poignant transformation comes in that interaction, that really famous interaction with Bob Cratchit, where before he treated Cratchit with utter contempt, he now surprises him by raising his salary and expressing concern for his struggling family. I'll raise your salary, he says, and endeavour to assist your family. And I think it's very important. He becomes like a second father to Tiny Tim. Of course, Tiny Tim lives, God bless us, every one of us. And there's a huge transformation, that huge transformation from his indifference, okay, his willingness to exploit Bob Cratchit, and now he's full of compassion, he's full of love, he's full of care and concern for his fellow man and woman, okay? He becomes a philanthropist in the fullest sense of the word. And then we've got that final line. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as a good old city knew. That cements Scrooge's redemption. But Dickens leaves us, I think, with an interesting question around Scrooge. And really, I think the message of the book itself. Is A Christmas Carol advocating, through Scrooge, for systemic change, or through Scrooge, is Dickens merely urging that we engage in individual acts of charity? So while Scrooge's transformation, that's really important, it's remarkable, you might argue it doesn't actually seem to challenge the structural inequalities that allowed his miserliness to flourish in the first place. The book offers a very hopeful, very endearing vision of human redemption. But if we're being perhaps critical and thinking about the book deeply, it does all of that within the confines of a social system and an economic system that remains unchanged by the close of the book. So I think we can say this. In the end, Dickens presents kindness and generosity, obviously through Scrooge's transformation, as virtues that can transform lives. But whether this is enough to address the deeper causes of poverty, maybe, okay, that's an open question. The book doesn't really answer that. So while A Christmas Carol does tell the story of one man's redemption, Scrooge's redemption, it is calling for social change on some level. The extent to which it's genuinely radical, though, as I've just said, rather than perhaps just a plea for compassion, is something that lots of people have debated and discussed. Now, the book also rewards a kind of allegorical reading where we think about the characters. And in this case, thinking of your exam preparation, we're thinking about the character of Scrooge. What does he represent? Very straightforwardly, he is a reflection of the greed and callousness of Victorian capitalism. But he is also showing that very emotionally hardened, kind of morally hardened people can change. I think it's worth thinking of the Cratchits at times as representing the poor who struggle and also demonstrating their humanity, and therefore they need social responsibility, or we all need social responsibility, and we need compassion. And I think Dickens is critiquing the horrifying neglect of the poor, but the book focuses on individual morality and individual life choices rather than suggesting kind of broader social change. So in that sense, it's not a revolutionary text. But what we've got is, through Scrooge's transformation, is a moral fable, okay? A moral tale advocating kindness, but within a capitalist framework. In some senses, it's quite a reassuring text in that it reassures the reader that reform, making society better, is actually possible merely through personal transformation. Dickens is suggesting that benevolence from people like Scrooge, so benevolence from the wealthy, the rich more generally, can improve the plight of the poor, but we don't really necessarily need to do very much about unpacking, undermining, challenging, overthrowing even violently social hierarchies and economic hierarchies. So Scrooge's transformation it's a case that Dickens is critical of greed and exploitation, but the focus on Scrooge and his transformation suggests that it's really a question of individual moral awakening rather than radical, broader social change. Okay? His journey then reminds us we can change. Transformation's possible. And this is a very positive message and a very endearing one and a very important one. Generosity, kindness, compassion towards others, all others, should guide us, not just during the Christmas period, but throughout every single day of our lives. So that's all for today on study sessions. I hope that's been useful. Make sure you're using this as you are answering this week's exam preparation work. Make sure that you are following so that when new episodes come out, you are notified. Share the episodes, encourage people, other members of Year 10 to be listening as well. Be of enormous benefit. And until next time, keep reading, keep working hard, keep revising, and stay curious.